Hello! Good afternoon, everybody. I am Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Storytime. And if by now you don't know what we're reading, or why we're reading it, or where we are in the book, I can't really help you. It's been 5 months of With War and Peace, and we're nearly at the end. We have arrived in the epilogue, and we should be done by Thursday. So, yay, us! And if you've missed any of it, just go back and watch the videos that are on the War and Peace playlist, because I couldn't possibly fill you in now. So like I said yesterday, we should, and like I said just now, we should be done by Thursday with the whole book, including the epilogue and a little note by Tolstoy. There's some appendixes at the end that are descriptions of historical events, but that aren't really relevant to the story. So if you're following along at home, you can read them for your own edification, but we're not going to read through an appendix. It doesn't make any sense, obviously. But yeah, by Thursday, we should be done with the whole book. And to facilitate that, and because of the way the book is written, today and the next few days, the readings will be a little bit longer, as it was yesterday, just because of the way the spacing is and the way Tolstoy broke it up. It's easier to break it up into 4 equal parts than to try to break it up into 5 or 6, like weirdly parts of different lengths. So just in case you're wondering, in case you missed that note. But then, like I said, then we'll be done on Thursday. Yay! We'll be done before September. Hooray! So that's April, May, June, July, August. About 5 months. Not bad, everybody. So that'll be exciting. And then still on the hunt for what book we will be reading after that. But we will take Friday off, obviously, because I'm not going to start a new book the next day. And probably a week, maybe 2 after that, maybe begin after Labor Day or something like that for future readings. And feel free to drop a line about what you'd like to read or what you thought of the reading so far. Always appreciate constructive criticism. So let's jump in. Like I said, we're in the epilogue, which is broken up into 2 parts. So we're in part 1 still. And we're going to read section 10 through 16, which is the end part of part 1. So, all right, jump on in. And as you may remember, Natasha has married Pierre and they have children. And currently she was visiting, when we last left off, she was visiting her brother, who is married Princess Maria, and they have children as well. And the Countess Rostov is living with her son and his wife, Princess Maria, now the Countess Maria. And Sonia is also living with them, which is like, whew. I mean, she's his cousin, but she was engaged to him at one point, and she's kind of always been in love with him, to live with him and his wife and their kids kind of a lot. But, whatever, you got to do what you got to do, family. So the old Countess Rostov and Sonia are living with Countess Maria, and Count Nikolai Rostov at their home now in Bald Hills. And they have children, like I said, and also her nephew from her now deceased brother, Prince Andrei, the young, I believe his name was also Andrei. Andrushka, I think they called him. Or was it Nikolai? How could I not remember at this point? It was Nikolai, I think. Yeah. He is with them as well. So yeah, quick recap on the characters. But let's jump in. So section 10. Natasha was married in the early spring of 1813, and by 1820, she already had 3 daughters and 1 son whom she had passionately wished for and was now nursing herself. She had filled out and broadened so that it was difficult to recognize in this strong mother the former slender, nimble Natasha. The features of her face had defined themselves and bore an expression of softness and serenity. In her face there was not, as formerly, that ceaselessly burning fire of animation that had constituted her charm. Now one often saw only her face and her face and body, while her soul was not seen at all. One saw only a strong, beautiful, and fruitful female. Very rarely was the former fire kindled in her now. It happened only when, as now, her husband returned home, or a sick child recovered, or she and Countess Mary remembered Prince Andrei. She never spoke of him with her husband, and supposing that he was jealous of Prince Andrei's memory. And very rarely, when something chanced to draw her into singing, which she had abandoned completely after marriage. And in those rare moments when the former fire was kindled in her developed, beautiful body, she was still more attractive than before. Since the time of her marriage, Natasha and her husband had lived in Moscow, Petersburg, on the estate near Moscow, and with her mother, that is, with Nikolai. The young Countess Bezukov was little seen in society, and those who saw her remained displeased. She was neither sweet nor amiable. It was not that Natasha liked solitude. She did not know whether she liked it or not. It even seemed to her that she did not. But bearing, giving birth to, and nursing her children, and taking part in every minute of her husband's life, she was unable to satisfy those needs otherwise than by giving up society. Everyone who had known Natasha before her marriage was surprised at the change that had taken place in her, as at something extraordinary. Only the old countess, with her mother's intuition, understood that all Natasha's impulses came only from the need to have a family, to have a husband, as she, not so much joking as in earnest, had cried out once in Otrádnoe. Her mother was surprised at the surprise of the people who did not understand Natasha, who kept repeating that she had always known that Natasha would make an exemplary wife and mother. Only she carries her love for her husband and children to such an extreme, said the countess, that it's even stupid. Natasha did not follow that golden rule preached by intelligent people, especially the French, according to which a girl, once married, should not let herself go, should not abandon her talents, should be still more concerned with her appearance than when unmarried, should entice her husband just as she had enticed him before he was her husband. Natasha, on the contrary, at once abandoned all her charms, among which one was extraordinarily strong, her singing. She abandoned it precisely because it was a strong charm. She, as they put it, let herself go. Natasha took no trouble either about her manners, or about the delicacy of her speech, or about showing herself to her husband in the most advantageous poses, or about her toilet, or about not hampering her husband with her demands. She did everything contrary to these rules. She felt that the charms which her instinct had taught her to make use of before would now only be ridiculous in the eyes of her husband, to whom, from the first moment, she had given herself entirely. That is, with her whole soul, not leaving one little corner that was not open to him. She felt that her bond with her husband held, not by those poetic feelings that had attracted him to her, but by something else, indefinite but firm, like the bond between her own soul and body. To fluff up her curls, wear hoop skirts, and sing romances in order to attract her own husband would have seemed as strange to her as to adorn herself in order to be pleased with herself. And to adorn herself in order to be liked by others, maybe she would have enjoyed that now, she did not know, but she simply had no time for it. The main reason why she was not occupied with singing, with dressing, or with thinking over her words was that she had absolutely no time to be occupied with them. It is known that man has the ability to immerse himself entirely in one subject, however insignificant it might seem, and it is known that there is no subject so insignificant that it will not expand to infinity if attention is concentrated on it. The subject that had absorbed Natasha fully was her family, that is, her husband, who had to be kept in such a way as to belong entirely to her, to the household, and to her children, whom she had to carry, give birth to, nurse, and bring up. And the more she entered into the subject that absorbed her, not with her mind, but with her whole soul, with her whole being, the more that subject expanded under her attention, and the weaker and more insignificant of her being forces seemed to her, or weaker and more insignificant her own forces seemed to her, so that she concentrated them all on one thing, and still had no time to do anything that seemed necessary to her. Discussions and arguments about women's rights, about the relations between spouses, about their freedom and rights, though they had not yet been called questions as they are now, were the same then as they are now, but these questions not only did not interest Natasha, but she decidedly did not understand them. These questions, then as now, existed only for those people who see in marriage nothing but the pleasure the spouses get from each other, that is, nothing but the beginnings of marriage, and not its whole significance, which consists in the family. These arguments and present-day questions, similar to the question of how to get as much pleasure as possible from a dinner, did not exist then, as they do not exist now, for people for whom the purpose of a dinner is nourishment and the purpose of marriage is the family. If the purpose of a dinner is to nourish the body, then someone who suddenly eats 2 dinners will perhaps achieve greater pleasure, but will not achieve his purpose because his stomach will not digest 2 dinners. If the purpose of marriage is the family, then someone who wishes to have many wives or husbands will perhaps get much pleasure, but in any case will have no family. If the purpose of a dinner is nourishment and the purpose of marriage is the family, then the whole question is solved simply by not eating more than the stomach can digest and not having more wives and husbands that are needed for a family. That is, one of each. Natasha needed a husband. A husband was given her, and the husband gave her a family. And not only did she see no need for another, better husband, but as all her inner forces were directed at serving this husband and family, she could not even imagine and saw no interest in imagining how it would be if it were different. Natasha did not like society in general, but she valued all the more the society of her relations, Countess Maria, her brother, her mother, and Sonia. She valued the society of the people to whom, disheveled in a dressing gown, she could come striding out of the nursery with a joyful face and show a diaper with a yellow instead of a green stain and hear comforting words that the baby was now much better. Natasha let herself go to such a degree that her clothes, her hair, her words spoken out of place, her jealousy — she was jealous of Sonia, of the governess, of any woman, beautiful or not — were habitual subjects of jokes among all those close to her. The general opinion was that Pierre was under his wife's heel, and in fact it was so. From the very first day of their marriage, Natasha had announced her demands. Pierre was very surprised by his wife's view, which was completely new to him, that every minute of his life belonged to her and the family. Pierre was surprised by his wife's demands, but was flattered by them and submitted to them. Pierre's subjection consisted in his not daring, not only to flirt, but even to talk smilingly with another woman, not daring to go to clubs or dinners just to pass the time, not daring to spend money on whims, not daring to leave for long periods of time except on business, in which his wife also included his intellectual pursuits, of which she understood nothing, but to which she ascribed great importance. In exchange for that, Pierre had the full right at home to dispose as he liked, not only of himself, but of the whole family as well. At home, Natasha put herself on the footing of her husband's slave, and the whole house went on tiptoe when Pierre was busy reading or writing in his study. Pierre needed only to show some predilection for what he liked to be invariably fulfilled. He needed only to express a wish for Natasha to jump up at once and run to fulfill it. The entire household was governed only by the imaginary orders of the husband, that is, by Pierre's wishes, which Natasha tried to guess. The manner and the place of their life, their acquaintances, their connections, Natasha's occupations, the raising of the children. Not only was everything done according to the express will of Pierre, but Natasha tried to guess what might follow from Pierre's thoughts, voiced in conversation. And she rightly guessed the essence of Pierre's wishes, and, having once guessed it, she firmly held to what she had chosen. When Pierre himself wanted to be unfaithful to his wish, she fought him with his own weapons. Thus, during a difficult time which Pierre remembered ever after, when Natasha had given birth to a first weak child, and they had to change wet nurses 3 times, and Natasha had become sick with despair, Pierre had told her once of Rousseau's thoughts, with which he was in complete agreement, about the unnaturalness and unharmfulness of wet nurses. With the next child, despite the opposition of her mother, the doctors, and the husband himself, who rose up against her nursing as a then unheard of and harmful thing, she had stood her ground, and from then on had nursed all her children herself. Quite often, in moments of irritation, it happened that the husband and wife would spend a long time arguing, and then, after the argument, Pierre, to his joy and surprise, would find not only in his wife's words, but in her actions, the very thought she had been arguing against. And he not only found the same thought, but found it purified of whatever had been superfluous, provoked by passion and argument, in his expression of it. After 7 years of married life, Pierre felt a joyful, firm consciousness that he was not a bad man, and he felt it because he saw himself reflected in his wife. In himself he felt all the good and the bad mixed together and obscuring each other, but only when what was truly good was reflected in his wife. All that was not entirely good was rejected, and this reflection came not by the way of logical thinking, but otherwise, as a mysterious, unmeditated reflection. As a mysterious, unmediated reflection. Section 11. 2 months before then, Pierre, already visiting with the Rostovs, had received a letter from Prince Fyodor, summoning him to Petersburg to discuss important questions which interested the members of a society in Petersburg, of which Pierre was one of the chief founders. Having read this letter, as she read all her husband's letters, Natasha herself suggested that he go to Petersburg, hard as his absence was for her, to all that belonged to her husband's intellectual, abstract pursuits. Without understanding them, she ascribed enormous importance, and she was in constant fear of being a hindrance to this activity of her husband's. To Pierre's timid, questioning glance after reading the letter, she responded by asking him to go, but only to determine for a certain the time of his return, and he was granted a 4-week leave. Ever since the term of Pierre's leave had expired 2 weeks before then, Natasha had been in a constant state of fear, sadness, and irritation. Denisov, a retired general discontented with the current state of affairs, who came during those last 2 weeks, looked at Natasha with surprise and sadness, as at an unfaithful portrait of a once loved person. A dull, despondent gaze, out-of-place replies, and the conversation about the nursery was all he saw and heard from the former enchantress. Natasha was sad and irritated all the time, especially when her mother, her brother, or Countess Marya, comforting her, tried to excuse Pierre and think up reasons for his delay. "It's all foolishness, all trifles," said Natasha. "All his reflections which don't lead to anything, and all those stupid societies." She said of the very things in the great importance of which she firmly believed, and she would go off to the nursery to nurse her only boy, Petya. No one could tell her anything to so soothing and sensible as this little 3-month-old being, when he lay at her breast and she felt the movement of his mouth and the puffing of his little nose. This being said, "You're angry, you're jealous, you'd like to take revenge on him, you're afraid, but here I am, here I am." And there was nothing to reply. It was more than true. In those 2 weeks of worry, Natasha so often resorted to the baby to be soothed, so fussed over him, that she overfed him and he fell sick. She was terrified by his illness, but at the same time it was what she needed. Taking care of him made it easier for her to endure the worry about her husband. She was nursing when the noise of Pierre's sleigh was heard in the drive, and the nanny, who knew what would gladden her mistress, came through the door inaudibly but quickly with a beaming face. "He's come?" Natasha said in a quick whisper, afraid to move, lest she awaken the baby, who was falling asleep. "He's come, dearie," whispered the nanny. The blood rushed to Natasha's face, and her feet made an involuntary movement, but she could not jump up and run. The baby opened his eyes again and looked. "You're here," he seemed to say, and then again lazily smacked his lips. Having gently withdrawn her breast, Natasha rocked the baby, handed him over to the nanny, and went with quick steps to the door. But at the door she stopped, as if feeling a pang of remorse that, in her gladness, she had left the baby too quickly, and turned to look. The nanny, her elbows raised, was lifting the baby over the railing of his little bed. Just go, dearie, don't worry, just go," the nanny whispered, smiling with the familiarity that is usually established between a nanny and her mistress. And Natasha ran with light steps to the front hall. Denisov, with his pipe, coming out from the study to the reception room, here recognized Natasha for the first time. A bright, shining, joyful light was pouring in streams from her transformed face. "He's come," she said to him on the run, and Denisov felt that he was delighted by the fact that Pierre, for whom he had very little love, had come. Having run to the front hall, Natasha saw a tall figure in a fur coat unwinding a scarf. "It's him, really, here he is," she said to himself, and flying to him, she embraced him, pressed his head to her breast, and then, pushing it away, looked at the frosty, red-cheeked, happy face of Pierre. Yes, it's him, happy, content. And suddenly she remembered all the torments of waiting that she had felt over the last 2 weeks. The joy shining on her face vanished. She frowned, and a stream of reproaches and angry words poured out on Pierre. "Yes, it's fine for you. You're very glad. You had a good time. But what about me? You might at least feel sorry for the children. I'm nursing. My milk went bad. Petya almost died. And you're having a good time. Yes, a good time." Pierre knew he was not guilty because he could not have come sooner. He knew that this outburst was improper on her part, and he knew that in 2 minutes it would pass. He knew above all that he himself was cheery and happy. He would have liked to smile, but did not even dare to think of it. He made a pitiful, frightened face and cowered. "I couldn't, by God, but how's Petya?" "He's all right now. Let's go. You ought to be ashamed. If only you could see how I am without you, how I suffered." "Are you well?" Let's go," she said, holding on to his hand, and they went to their rooms. When Nikolai and his wife came looking for Pierre, he was in the nursery, holding his awakened nursling son on his enormous right palm, dandling him. A merry smile lingered on his broad face with its open, toothless mouth. The storm had long since spent itself, and a bright, joyful sun shone on the face of Natasha, who gazed tenderly at her husband and son. And you talked it all over well with Prince Fyodor? Natasha was saying. Yes, perfectly. See, he holds it up. His head, Natasha meant. But how he frightened me. And did you see the princess? Is it true that she's in love with that? Yes, can you imagine? Just then Nikolai and Countess Maria came in. Pierre, without putting his son down, bent over, exchanged kisses with them, and answered their questions. But obviously, despite the many interesting things that had to be discussed, the baby in his little hat with his wobbly head absorbed all Pierre's attention. How sweet he is, said Countess Maria, looking at the baby and playing with him. This is what I don't understand, Nicholas. She turned to her husband. How is it that you don't understand the charm of these charming little miracles? I just don't. I can't, said Nikolai, looking at the baby with a cold gaze. A piece of meat. Let's go, Pierre. Yet the main thing is, he's such an affectionate father, said Countess Maria to justify her husband, but only when they're a year old or so. No, Pierre is an excellent nanny, said Natasha. He says his hand was just made to fit a baby's bottom. Look. Well, not only for that, said Pierre, laughing, suddenly lifting the baby and handing him to the nanny. Section 12. As in every real family, several totally different worlds lived together in the house at Bald Hills, each maintaining its own particularity and yielding to the others, but merging into one harmonious whole. Every event that occurred in the house was equally, joyfully or sadly, important for all the worlds, but each world had its own reasons, independent of the others, for rejoicing or lamenting over whatever the event might be. Thus, Pierre's coming was a joyful, important event, and as such, it had an effect on everyone. The servants, the most reliable judges of their masters, because they judge not by conversations and expressions of feelings, but by acts and manners of life, were glad of Pierre's coming, because with him there, they knew the Count would stop going to the farm work every day, would be more joyful and kind, and also because everybody would get costly presents for the feast day. The children and the governesses were glad of Bezukhov's coming because no one else drew them into a common life so well as Pierre. He alone could play on the clavichord the écossaise, his only piece, to which one could dance, as he said, all possible dances, and he had surely brought everyone presents. Nikolenka, who was now a thin 15-year-old boy with curly blonde hair and beautiful eyes, sickly and intelligent, was glad because Uncle Pierre, as he called him, was the object of his admiration and passionate love. No one had instilled any special love for Pierre into Nikolenka, and he saw him only rarely. Countess Maria, who had brought him up, employed all her powers to make Nikolenka love her husband as she loved him, and Nikolenka did love his uncle, but he loved him with a barely noticeable shade of contempt. As for Pierre, he adored him. He did not want to be a hussar or a chevalier of St. George like Uncle Nikolai. He wanted to be a learned and intelligent and kind like Pierre. In Pierre's presence, there was always a joyful radiance on his face, and he blushed and became breathless whenever Pierre addressed him. He never missed a single word of what Pierre said, and afterwards, with de Sales or alone with himself, he would recall and ponder the meaning of Pierre's word, every word. Pierre's past, his misfortunes, before the year 12, of which he had put together a vague, poetic picture from what he had heard, his adventures in Moscow, his captivity, Platon Karatev, of whom he had heard from Pierre, his love for Natasha, whom the boy had also loved with a special love, and above all his friendship with his father, whom Nikolenka did not remember, all this made Pierre a hero and a sacred figure for him. From words he let fall about his father and Natasha, from the excitement with which Pierre spoke of the dead man, and from the cautious, reverential tenderness with which Natasha spoke of him, the boy, who was only beginning to suspect about love, put together the notion that his father had loved Natasha and had bequeathed her upon dying to his friend. This father, whom the boy did not remember, appeared to him as a deity, whom it was impossible to imagine, and of whom he did not think otherwise than with a thrill in his heart and tears of sadness and rapture. And the boy was happy on account of Pierre's coming. The guests were glad of Pierre as a man who always animated and united any company. The adults of the household, not to mention his wife, were glad of him as a friend in whose presence life was easier and calmer. The old ladies were glad of the presents he would be bringing, and above all that Natasha would come to life again. Pierre felt the various views of these various worlds upon him and hastened to give each person what was expected. Pierre, the most absent-minded and forgetful of men, had this time brought everything, according to the list his wife had drawn up, and not forgetting either the errands for her mother and brother or the present of fabric for Mrs. Belov's dress or the toys for his nephews. In the early days of his marriage, this demand of his wife's that he do that and not forget anything he had undertaken to buy had seemed strange to him, and he had been struck by her serious distress when on his first trip he had forgotten everything, but later on he got used to it. Knowing that Natasha never asked anything for herself and asked for others only when he volunteered, he now, unexpectedly for himself, took a childlike pleasure in this buying of presents for the whole household and never forgot anything. If he did earn Natasha's reproach, it was only for buying things that were superfluous and too expensive. In the opinion of most people, to her other shortcomings, or qualities in Pierre's opinion, the slovenliness, letting herself go, Natasha had also added stinginess. From the time when Pierre began to live in a big household, a family, which required big expenses, he noticed to his surprise that he was spending twice less than before, and that his affairs, recently upset in particular by his first wife's debts, had begun to improve. Life was cheaper because it was restricted. Pierre no longer had, nor wished to have, the most expensive luxury, which is the kind of life that can be changed at any moment. He felt that his way of life was now defined once and for all, till death, that to change it was not in his power, and therefore this way of life was cheap. Pierre was sorting out his purchases with a merry, smiling face. "Look at this," he said, unfolding a length of cotton like a shopkeeper. Natasha sat facing him, holding her elder daughter on her lap, and quickly shifting her shining eyes from her husband to what he was displaying. "That's for Mrs. Belov? Excellent." She felt it for the quality. "A rouble, probably." Pierre told her the price. "Expensive," said Natasha. "Well, how glad the children will be. And maman, only you needn't have bought this for me," she added, unable to suppress a smile, and admiring a gold and pearl comb, such as were only just coming into fashion. "Adele got me confused. Buy it," said Pierre. "When will I ever wear it?" Natasha put it in her braid. "It's for Mashenka's coming out. Maybe they'll be wearing them again by then. Well, come on." And taking the presents, they went first to the nursery and then to the Countess. The Countess, as usual, was sitting with Mrs. Belov over a double patience when Pierre and Natasha, packages under their arms, came into the drawing room. The Countess was already past 60. Her hair was completely white, and she wore a cap with a ruffle that went all the way around her face. Her face was wrinkled, and her upper lip was sunken, and her eyes were dull. After the deaths of her son and her husband, which had followed so quickly upon each other, she felt herself an accidentally forgotten being in the world, with no purpose or meaning. She ate, drank, slept, woke, but did not live. Life gave her no impressions at all. She needed nothing from life except peace, and that peace she could find only in death. But as long as death did not come, she had to live, that is, to make use of her time, her life forces. In her there was noticeable in the highest degree what one notices in very small children and very old people. In her life no external purpose could be seen, but what was evident was only the need to exercise her various inclinations and abilities. She needed to eat, to sleep, to think, to talk, to weep, to work, to get angry, and so on, only because she had a stomach, a brain, muscles, nerves, and a liver. She did all that without any external impulse, not as people do in the full force of life when, behind the purposes they are striving towards, they do not notice another purpose, that of applying their forces. She talked only because she had a physical need to work her lungs and tongue. She wept like a baby because she had to clear her nose, and so on. What, for people in full force, presented itself as a purpose, for her was obviously a pretext. Thus, in the morning, especially if she had eaten something rich the day before, a need to be angry appeared in her, and then she chose the closest pretext, Mrs. Belov's deafness. She would begin to say something softly to her from the other end of the room. "It seems warmer today, my dear," she would say in a whisper, and when Mrs. Belov replied, "Why, of course they've come," the Countess would grumble crossly, "My God, how deaf and stupid she is." Another pretext was her snuff, which seemed to her now dry, now damp, now poorly rubbed. After these irritations, bile would spread over her face, and her maids knew by sure signs when Mrs. Belov would again be deaf, and the snuff would again be damp, and when her face would turn yellow. As she needed her bile to work, so she also sometimes needed her remaining thinking capacity to work, and the pretext for that was a game of patience. When she needed to weep, the object was the late Count. When she needed to worry, the pretext was Nikolai and his health. When she needed to speak caustically, the pretext was Countess Maria. When she needed to exercise her vocal organs, this happened mainly between 7 and 6, after a digestive rest in a dark room, then the pretext was telling of ever the same stories to ever the same lips. Pierre, Natasha, and Maria was this mutual understanding of her condition expressed. Besides that, these glances said something else. They said that she had already finished her business in life, that all of her was not in that which could be seen in her now, that we would all be the same, that it was a joy to submit to her, to restrain oneself for the sake of this being once so dear, once as full of life as we, and now so pathetic. Memento mori, said the glances. Of all the household, only quite bad and stupid people, and the little children did not understand that and avoided her. Section 13. When Pierre and his wife came to the drawing room, the Countess was in the habitual state of needing to occupy herself with the mental work of double patience, and therefore, though she said out of habit the words she always spoke when Pierre or her son returned, "It's high time, my dear, we've been waiting and waiting, well, thank God," and as the presents were given to her, said other habitual words, "It's not the gift that's dear, my friend, thank you for thinking of an old woman like me." One could see that Pierre's coming was disagreeable to her at the moment because it distracted her from her unfinished game of double patience. She finished the patience and only then received the presents. The presents consisted of a wonderfully worked case for cards, a bright blue Sèvres cup with a lid and pictures of shepherdesses, and a gold snuff box with a portrait of the late Count, which Pierre had ordered from a miniaturist in Petersburg. The Countess had long been wishing for that. She did not feel like weeping now, and therefore glanced indifferently at the portrait and interested herself more in the case. "Thank you, my friend, you've comforted me," she said, as she always did. "But the best thing is that you've brought yourself. I've never seen the like of it. You ought to give your wife a scolding. What is it? She's like a crazy person without you. Doesn't see anything, doesn't remember anything," she said to her habitual words. "Look, Anna Timofina," she added, "what a case our boys brought me." Mrs. Belov praised the gifts and admired her cotton fabric. Though Pierre, Natasha, Nikolai, Marya, and Denisov had much to talk about, that they would not speak in the Countess's presence, not because anything was concealed from her, but because she was so behind in many things that if one began to say something in her presence, it would be necessary to answer her questions put in inappropriately, and repeat more than once what had already been repeated to her several times. To tell her that this one had died, that one had married, which she once more would not remember. But they sat over tea as usual by the samovar in the drawing room, and Pierre answered the Countess's questions, needless for her and of interest to no one, saying that Prince Vasily had aged and that Countess Marya Vasilyevna had sent her greetings and remembered her, and so on. Such conversations of interest to no one but necessary went on all through tea. For tea around the round table in the samovar, at which Sonia presided, all the grown-up persons of the household gathered. The children, tutors, and governesses had already had tea, and their voices could be heard in the neighboring sitting room. At tea, everyone sat in their usual places. Nikolai sat at a little table by the stove, where tea was served to him. The old boar's eye bitch, Milka, daughter of the first Milka, was with a totally gray-haired face, against which her big, black, protruding eyes showed more sharply, lay in an armchair beside him. Denisov, with his half-gray curly hair, mustache, and side whiskers, in an unbuttoned general's tunic, sat next to Countess Marya. Pierre sat between his wife and the old countess. He was talking about what he knew might interest the old lady and be understood by her. He spoke of external social events and of the people who had once made up the circle of the old countess's contemporaries, who had once been an actual living, definite circle, but who now, mostly scattered over the world, were living out their time, as she was, gleaning the remaining years of what had been sown in their lives. But these contemporaries, seemed to the old countess the only serious and real world. From Pierre's animation, Natasha could see that his trip had been interesting, that he would have liked to tell about many things, but he did not dare speak in the countess's presence. Denisov, besides his not being a member of the family, and therefore not understanding Pierre's cautiousness, was quite interested, as a disgruntled man, in what was happening in Petersburg, and constantly provoked Pierre into telling now about some story that had just happened in the Semyonovsky regiment, now about a Greek chief, and now about the Biblical Society. Pierre occasionally got carried away and began telling, but Nikolai and Natasha brought him back each time to the health of Prince Ivan and Countess Maria Antonovna. Well, what about all that madness? Gosner and the Tatagrievnov woman. Is that still going on? Still going on, ha! Cried Pierre, stronger than ever. The Biblical Society. Now that's the whole government. What's that, mon cher ami? Asked the Countess, who had finished her tea and was clearly wished to find a pretext for getting angry after eating. What's that you say, the government? I don't understand it. You know, maman, interrupted Nikolai, who knew how to translate everything into his mother's language. It's that Prince Alexander Nikolaevich Golitsyn who has organized a society, so they say it's become very influential. A Greek chief in Golitsyn, Pierre said imprudently. That's now the whole government. And what a government! They see conspiracies everywhere. They're afraid of everything. Why, what fault is that of Prince Alexander Nikolaevich? He's a very respectable man. I used to meet him at Maria Antonovna's, the Countess said offendedly, and still more offended than everyone fell silent, she went on. Nowadays, everybody finds fault, an evangelical society. Well, what's wrong with that? And she stood up, everyone also stood up, and with a stern look, sailed back to her table in the sitting room. Amidst the sad silence that ensued, the children's laughter and voices were heard from the neighboring room. Evidently, some joyful excitement was going on among the children. Ready? Ready? Little Natasha's joyful cry was heard over everyone else's. Pierre exchanged glances with Countess Maria and Nikolai. Natasha, he always saw, and smiled happily. That's wonderful music, he said. It's Anna Makarovna's finishing her stocking, said Countess Maria. Oh, I'll go and see, said Pierre, jumping up. Do you know why I especially love that music? He said, stopping at the door. They're the first to let me know that everything's all right. Coming today, the closer I got to the house, the more frightened I was. As I first came in the front hall, I heard Andrushka's laughing his head off about something. Well, that meant everything was all right. I know the feeling, Nikolai agreed. I mustn't go. The stockings are a surprise for me. Pierre went to the children, and the laughter and the shouting still grew louder. Well, Anna Makarovna, Pierre's voice was heard. Come here to the middle, and at my command, 1, 2, and when I say 3, you stand here, and you in my arms. Now, 1, 2, and Pierre's voice, there was a hush. 3, and a rapturous groan of children's voices arose in the room. 2, 2, shouted the children. That meant 2 stockings, which, by a secret known only to herself, Anna Makarovna knitted at once on her needles, and which she always drew triumphantly one out of the other before the children when the stockings were finished. Section 14. Soon after the children came to say good night. The children kissed everyone. The tutors and the governesses bowed and left. Only de Sales and his pupil remained. The tutor suggested in a whisper that his pupil go downstairs. Non, monsieur de Sales, je demanderai à ma tante de rester. I'll ask my aunt to let me stay, Nikolenka Bolkonsky replied, also in a whisper. Ma tante, please let me stay, said Nikolenka, going up to his aunt. His face expressed entreaty, excitement, and rapture. Countess Maria glanced at him and turned to Pierre. When you're here, he can't tear himself away, she said to him. Je vous le ramènerai tout à l'heure, monsieur de Sales. Bonsoir. I'll bring him back to you right away, monsieur de Sales. Good evening, said Pierre, giving his hand to the Swiss, and smiling, he addressed Nikolenka. We haven't seen each other at all. Look at the resemblance, Marie, he added, turning to Countess Maria. To my father, said the boy, blushing deeply and looking up at Pierre with admiring, shining eyes. Pierre nodded to him and went on with the story, interrupted by the children. Countess Maria worked on her embroidery. Natasha looked at her husband without taking her eyes away. Nikolai and Denisov got up, asked for pipes, smoked, took tea from Sonia, who sat sullenly and stubbornly at the samovar, and questioned Pierre. The curly-headed, sickly boy, with his shining eyes, sat in the corner unnoticed by anyone, and only turning his curly head on his thin neck, emerging from a turned-down collar to the side where Pierre was, occasionally trembled and whispered something to himself, clearly experiencing some new and strong feeling. The conversation turned around the contemporary gossip from the highest government, in which the majority of people ordinarily see the most important interest of internal politics. Denisov, discontented with the government for his own unsuccess in the service, was glad to learn about all the stupid things which, in his opinion, were being done in Petersburg, and made his observation on Pierre's words in sharp and strong terms. Before you had to be a German, now you have to dance with this Tatagrinov woman and Madame Hugen to Red, Echergretschen, and the rest. Ah, I'd turn that fellow Bonaparte loose on them. He'd knock all this foolishness out of them. Well, have you ever seen anything like it? Giving the Semyonovsky regiment to the foot soldier Schwartz, he shouted. Nikolai, though without Denisov's wish to find everything bad, also considered it very worthwhile and important thing to discuss the government, and considering the fact that A was appointed minister here and B governor general over there, and the sovereign said such and such, but the minister said such and such, that all this was a very significant matter, and he considered it necessary to be interested in it and question Pierre about it. Under the questioning of these two interlocutors, the conversation never departed from the usual character of gossip about high spheres of government. But Natasha, knowing all the ways and thoughts of her husband, saw that Pierre had long wanted to, but could not lead the conversation to a different way and voice his innermost thought, the one for which he had gone to Petersburg and to consult his new friend, Prince Fyodor, she helped him with a question: how was his business with Prince Fyodor? What is it about? Asked Nikolai. The same thing all over again, said Pierre, glancing around. Everybody sees that things are taking a nasty turn, that they can't be left like this, and it's the duty of all honest men to oppose it as far as they can. But what can honest men do? Nikolai said, frowning slightly. What can be done? Here's what. Let's go to my study, said Nikolai. Natasha, who had long anticipated that they would come to fetch her to nurse the baby, heard the nanny call and went to the nursery. Countess Maria went with her. The men went to the study, and Nikolenka Bolkonsky, unnoticed by his uncle, went there too and sat in the shadow by the window at the writing table. Well, what are you going to do? Asked Denisov. Eternal fantasies, said... Well, what are you going to do? Asked Denisov. Eternal fantasies, said Nikolai. Here's what, Pierre began, not sitting down and now pacing the room, now listening, now stopping, lisping, and making rapid gestures with his hands while he talked. Here's what. The situation in Petersburg is like this. The sovereign doesn't enter into anything. He's totally given up to this mysticism. Pierre could not forgive mysticism in anyone now. All he seeks is peace, and peace can be given him only by those people sans foi ni loi, without faith or law, who hack up and stifle everything far and wide. Magnitsky, Arikchiv, a tutti quanti, all that sort. You'll agree that if you weren't personally taken up with farming, you'd only wanted peace, then the harsher your bailiff, the sooner you'll achieve your purpose. He turned to Nikolai. Well, but what are you getting at? Said Nikolai. Well, and so everything's falling apart. There's thievery in the courts, in the army, only the rod, drill, settlements. They torment the people, stifle enlightenment. Whatever is young and honest, they destroy. Everybody sees that it can't go on like this. It's all too strained and bound to snap, Pierre said, as people have been saying as long as governments have existed, once they look attentively at any government whatever. I said just one thing to them in Petersburg. To whom? To whom? Asked Denisov. Well, you know to whom, said Pierre, looking significantly from under his eyebrows. To Prince Fyodor and all of them. To contribute to enlightenment and philosophy is all very well, of course. It's a splendid aim and all, but in the present circumstances, something else is needed. Just then Nikolai noticed the presence of his nephew. His face darkened. He went over to him. What are you doing here? Why, let him be, said Pierre, taking Nikolai by the arm, and he went on. That's not enough, I told them. Something else is needed now. When you stand and wait for that tightened string to snap at any moment, when everybody's waiting for that inevitable upheaval, people must join hands, and as closely as possible, in order to oppose the general catastrophe. Everything young and strong is drawn there and gets corrupted. One is seduced by women, another by honors, a third by vainglory or money, and they go over to the other camp. There's no independent people like you and me left. I say, expand the circle of society. Let the mot d'ordre watchword be not only virtue, but independence and activity. Nikolai, having let his nephew be, angrily moved up his armchair, sat down in it, and as he listened to Pierre, coughed discontentedly and frowned more and more. But what's the purpose of your activity? He cried. And in what relation will you stand to the government? Here's in what, in the relation of helpers. The society may not be secret if the government allows it. Not only is it hostile to the government, but it is a society of true conservatives, a society of gentlemen in the full sense of the word. It's only so as not to have Pugachev come tomorrow and put a knife into my and your children, or to have a Greek chief send me to a military settlement. We're joining hands only for that, with one purpose of the common good and common society. Yes, but it's but a secret society, constantly a hostile and harmful one, which can only breed evil, said Nikolai, raising his voice. Why so? Did Tugendbund, which did the Tugendbund, which saved Europe, they still did not dare to think then that Russia had saved Europe, breed anything harmful? The Tugendbund is an alliance of virtue. It is love, mutual aid. It's what Christ preached on the cross. Natasha, who had come into the room in the middle of the conversation, looked joyfully at her husband. She did not rejoice in what he was saying. She was not interested in it, because it seemed to her that it was all extremely simple and that she had long known it. It seemed so because she knew where it all came from, this whole soul of Pierre. But she rejoiced looking at his animated, rapturous figure. With still more joyful rapture, Pierre was looked at by the boy they had all forgotten, with his thin neck emerging from a turned-down collar. Every word of Pierre's burned his heart, and with a nervous movement of the fingers, not noticing it himself, he kept breaking the pens and sticks of sealing wax that were lying on his uncle's table. Well, what I'm proposing is not at all like what you think, but something like what the German Tugendbund was. Well, brother, the Tugendbund is fine for sausage makers. I don't understand it and can't even pronounce it, the loud, resolute voice of Denisov rang out. Everything's nasty and vile, I agree. Only this Tugendbund I don't understand. But if you don't like these things, rebellion, that's the way. Je suis votre homme. I'm your man. Pierre smiled, Natasha laughed, but Nikolai knit his brows still more and began demonstrating to Pierre that no sort of upheaval was expected and that all the danger he was speaking of existed only in his imagination. Pierre demonstrated the contrary, and as his mental powers were stronger and more resourceful, Nikolai felt himself up against the wall. This made him still angrier, since in his heart, not by reasoning but by something stronger than reasoning, he knew the unquestionable rightness of his opinion. Here's what I'll tell you, he said, getting up and trying to prop his pipe in the corner with a nervous gesture and finally abandoning it. I can't prove anything to you. I can't prove anything to you. You say everything's bad with us and there'll be an upheaval. I don't see that. But you say an oath is a conventional thing, and to that I'll tell you, you're my best friend, you know that. But if you were to set up a secret society and start opposing the government, whatever it might be, I know that my duty is to obey it. And if a Reek chief ordered me right now to go against you with a squadron and cut you down, I'd go without thinking for a second. You can say whatever you like. After these words, an awkward silence ensued. Natasha was the first to speak, defending her husband and attacking her brother. Her defense was weak and awkward, but her purpose was achieved. The conversation picked up again, and no longer in that unpleasantly hostile tone in which Nikolai's last words had been spoken. When they all rose for supper, Nikolenka Bolkonsky went up to Pierre, pale, with shining, luminous eyes. Uncle Pierre, if Papa was alive, he'd agree with you? He asked. Pierre suddenly realized what a special, independent, complex, and intense work of feeling and thought must have been going on in this boy while he was talking, and recalling everything he had said, he was vexed that the boy had heard him. However, he had to give him an answer. I think so, he said reluctantly, and left the study. The boy bowed his head, and here it was as if he noticed for the first time what he had done on the table. He blushed and went over to Nikolai. Uncle, forgive me, I didn't mean to, he said, pointing to the broken pens and sticks of wax. Nikolai gave an angry start. All right, he said, throwing the pens and sticks of wax under the table, and clearly having a hard time suppressing the wrath that had risen in him, he turned away. You shouldn't have been here at all, he said. Probably not. Section 15. Over supper, the conversation was no longer about politics and society, but on the contrary, started on what was most pleasant for Nikolai, the memory of the year 12, which Denisov evoked, and in which Pierre was especially nice and amusing, and the family parted on the most friendly terms. When Nikolai, having undressed in his study after supper and given instructions to the steward who had long been waiting, went to the bedroom in his dressing gown, he found his wife still at the writing table. She was writing something. "What are you writing, Marie?" asked Nikolai. Countess Marya blushed. She was afraid that her husband would not understand or approve of what she was writing. She would have liked to hide what she had written from him, but at the same time, she was glad that he found her and that she could tell him. "It's my diary, Nicholas," she said, handing him a blue notebook covered with her firm, large handwriting. "Your diary?" Nikolai said with a shade of mockery and took the notebook from her. It was written in French. December 4. Today, Andrushka, the elder son, woke up and did not want to get dressed, and Mademoiselle Louise sent for me. He was capricious and headstrong. I tried to threaten him, but he became still more angry. Then I took it upon myself to let him be, and the nannies and I began getting the other children up, and I told him that I did not like him. He remained silent for a long time, as if he was surprised, and then, in nothing but his nightshirt, he jumped up to me and burst into such sobs that it was long before I could calm him down. It was clear that he had suffered most of all from having upset me, and then in the evening, when I gave him his little ticket, he again wept pitifully as he kissed me. With him, everything can be done by tenderness. "What is a little ticket?" asked Nikolai. "I've begun giving the older ones little reports in the evening on their behavior." Nikolai glanced into the luminous eyes that were looking at him and went on turning pages and reading. The diary contained everything from the children's life that their mother found noteworthy, expressing the children's character, or inspiring general thoughts about methods of upbringing. These were, for the most part, the most insignificant trifles, but they did not seem so either to the mother or to the father as he now read this children's diary for the first time. For December 5 there was written, "Mitya was mischievous at the table. Papa ordered that he not be given dessert. He was not, but he looked at the others so pitifully and greedily while they ate. I think that to punish by depriving of sweets develops greed. Tell Nicholas." Nikolai set the book aside and looked at his wife. The luminous eyes gazed at him questioningly. Did he approve of her diary or not? There could be no doubt not only of Nikolai's approval, but also of his admiration of his wife. Maybe it needn't be done so pedantically. Maybe it needn't be done at all, thought Nikolai, but this tireless, eternal inner effort, aimed only at the moral good of the children, this he admired. If Nikolai could have been conscious of his feeling, he would have found that his firm, tender, and proud love for his wife had always been based on this feeling of wonder before her inner life, before that lofty moral world almost inaccessible to him, in which his wife lived always. He was proud that she was so intelligent and good, being conscious of his own insignificance before her in the spiritual world, and rejoiced the more that she, with her soul, not only belonged to him, but made up part of him. I approve very much, my dearest," he said with a significant air. And after some silence he added, "And I behaved badly today. You weren't in the study. Pierre and I began to argue and I got angry. It's impossible. He's such a child. I don't know what would happen to him if Natasha didn't keep him on a leash. Can you imagine why he went to Petersburg? They're setting up—" "I know," said Countess Marya. "Natasha told me." "Well, so you know," Nikolai went on, getting excited at the mere recollection of the argument. "He wants to convince me that it's the duty of every honest man to go against the government, whereas my oath and my duty— I'm sorry you weren't there. They all attacked me, Denisov and Natasha. Natasha is killingly funny. She really keeps him under her heel, but once it comes to arguments, she has no words of her own. She just speaks his words," Nikolai added, yielding to that irresistible impulse that makes us judge the nearest and dearest people. Nikolai forgot what he was saying about Natasha could be said word for word about himself in relation to his wife. "Yes, I've noticed that," said Countess Marya. "When I told him that my duty and oath were highest of all, he began proving God knows what. It's a pity you weren't there. What would you have said?" "In my opinion, you're completely right, and I told Natasha so. Pierre says that everybody's suffering, tormented, becoming depraved, and that our duty is to help our neighbors. Of course, he's right," said Countess Marya. "But he forgets that we have other, closer responsibilities, which God himself has indicated to us, and that we can risk ourselves, but not our children." "Well, that's what the same I told him," Nikolai picked up, fancying that he had indeed said the same thing. "But he keeps at it about love for one's neighbor and Christianity, and all that in front of Nikolenka, who also got into the study and broke everything. Ah, you know, Nicholas, I often suffer over Nikolenka, said Countess Marya. He's such an extraordinary boy, and I'm afraid I forget about him because of my own. We all have children, we all have relations, but he has nobody. He's eternally alone with his thoughts. Well, I don't think you have anything to reproach yourself with on his account. You've done and are doing everything for him that a most tender mother could do for her son. And naturally, I'm glad of that. He's a nice, nice boy. Today he was listening to Pierre in some sort of trance. And can you imagine, we go to supper, I look, and he's broken everything on my table to bits. And he told me at once. I've never seen him tell a lie. A nice, nice boy, repeated Nikolai, who in his heart did not like Nikolenka, but whom he was always ready to acknowledge as nice. Still, it's not the same as a mother, said Countess Marya. I feel it's not the same, and I suffer over it. A wonderful boy, but I am terribly afraid for him. Company would do him good. Well, it won't be long. This summer I'll take him to Petersburg, said Nikolai. Yes, Pierre has always been and will remain a dreamer, he went on, returning to the conversation in the study which had clearly disturbed him. Well, what do I care about all that? That a Rikchiv is no good, and the rest. What do I care, when I got married and had so many debts that they wanted to throw me into prison, and had a mother who was unable to see or understand it, and then you, the children, work. Is it for my own pleasure that I'm in the office and tending to business from morning till night? No, I know that I must work to comfort my mother, to pay you back, and to not leave the children as poor as I was. Countess Marya wanted to tell him that a man does not live by bread alone, that he ascribed too much importance to this business, but she knew it was unnecessary and useless to say it. She only took his hand and kissed it. He accepted this gesture of his wife's as an approval and confirmation of his thoughts, and after some silent reflection went on thinking aloud. You know, Marie, he said, today Ilya Mitrofanich, that was the business manager, came from the Tambov estate and told me that they're now offering 80,000 for the timber. And with an animated face, Nikolai began talking about the possibility of buying back Otrudno in a very short time. 10 more years of life, and I'll leave the children in an excellent situation. Countess Marya listened to her husband and understood that all he said to her. She knew that, when he thought aloud like that, he sometimes asked her what he had said, and was angry when he noticed that she had been thinking of something else. But it cost her great effort to do so, because what he said did not interest her at all. She looked at him and did not so much think about something else as feel about something else. She felt a submissive, tender love for this man, who would never understand all that she understood, and as if because of that, she loved him still more strongly, with a shade of passionate tenderness. Besides this feeling, which wholly absorbed her and kept her from entering into the details of her husband's plans, thoughts flashed in her head that had nothing to do with what he was talking about. She was thinking about her nephew. Her husband's account of his agitation over Pierre's talk had struck her deeply. Imagined various traits of his gentle, sensitive character, and thinking about her nephew, she also thought of her own children. She did not compare her nephew with her children, but compared her feelings for them, and she found it sad that something was lacking in her feeling for Nikolenka. Sometimes the thought occurred to her that this difference was caused by age, but she felt that she was guilty before him, that in her heart she promised herself to mend her ways and do the impossible, that is, in this life, to love her husband, her children, and Nikolenka, and all who were close to her, as Christ loved mankind. Countess Marya's soul always strove towards the infinite, eternal, and perfect, and therefore could never be at peace. The stern expression of concealed, lofty suffering of a soul burdened by a body came to her face. Nikolai looked at her. My God, what will become of us if she dies? As it seems to me, she will when she has such a face, he thought, and standing in front of the icon, he began to recite the evening prayers. Section 16. Natasha, left alone with her husband, also talked only a wife and husband can talk. That is, grasping thoughts and conveying them to each other with extraordinary clarity and quickness, in a way contrary to all the rules of logic, without recourse to opinions, conclusions, and deductions, but in a totally special way. Natasha was so used to talking with her husband in this way that for her a logical train of thought in Pierre served as a sure sign that something was wrong between them. When he began to speak reasonably and calmly, and when she, carried along by his example, began to do the same, she knew it would inevitably lead to a quarrel. From the very moment when they were left alone, Natasha, with wide open, happy eyes, went softly up to him and suddenly seized his head and pressed it to her breast, saying, "Now you're all mine, all mine. You won't get away." From that moment, such a conversation began, contrary to all laws of logic, contrary, if only because totally different subjects were discussed at once and the same time. This simultaneous discussion of many things not only did not hinder their clarity of understanding, but, on the contrary, was the surest sign that they fully understood each other. As everything in a dream is false, senseless, and contradictory, except for the feeling that guides the dream, so in this sort of communication, contrary to all the laws of reason, it was not the words that were consistent and clear, but only the feeling that guided them. Natasha told Pierre about her brother's daily life, about how she suffered and did not live without her husband, about how she had come to love Marie still more, and how Marie was better than her in all respects. In saying that, Natasha was sincerely acknowledging that she saw Marie's superiority, but while saying it, she demanded that Pierre still prefer her to Marie and to all other women. And now, especially after having seen so many women in Petersburg, that he repeated to her again. Pierre, in reply to Natasha's words, told her how unbearable it was for him to be at soirees and dinners with ladies in Petersburg. "I'd completely forgotten how to talk with ladies," he said. "It was simply boring, especially since I was so busy." Natasha looked at him intently and went on. "Marie is so lovely," she said. "How well she understands children. It's as if she sees only their souls. Yesterday, for instance, Mitenka began to fuss." "Ah, he's so much like his father," Pierre interrupted. Natasha understood why he made this observation about Mitenka's resemblance to Nikolai. He had an unpleasant memory of the argument with his brother-in-law and wanted to know Natasha's opinion about it. "Nikolenka has this weakness, that if something isn't generally accepted by everyone, he won't agree with it for anything. But I understand that you precisely value what we can ouvrir une carrière, open up a career." That you precisely value what can open up a career, she said, repeating the words that Pierre had said once. "No, the main thing is," said Pierre, "that for Nikolai, thoughts and arguments are an amusement, almost a pastime. Here he's collecting a library and has made it a rule not to buy a new book before he's read what he's bought. Sismondi, Rousseau, and Montesquieu," Pierre added with a smile. "You know how he began to soften his words, but Natasha interrupted him, letting him feel that it was unnecessary. "So you say thinking is an amusement for him?" "Yes, and for me, all the rest is an amusement. All the while I was in Petersburg, I saw everyone as if in a dream. When I'm taken up with a thought, all the rest is an amusement." "Ah, what a pity I didn't see you greet the children," said Natasha. "Which of them was most glad?" "Lisa, surely." "Yes," said Pierre, and he went on with what occupied him. "Nikolai says we shouldn't think. But I can't help it, not to speak of the fact that in Petersburg I felt, I can tell you, that without me it would all fall apart, each one pulling in his own direction. But I succeeded in uniting them all, and besides, my thought is so simple and clear. I don't say we should oppose this or that. We may be mistaken. What I say is, let's join hands with those who love the good, and let there be one banner, active virtue. Prince Sergei is a nice man and intelligent." Natasha would have no doubt that Pierre's thought was a great thought, but one thing confused her. It was the fact that he was her husband. Can it be that a man so important and necessary for society is at the same time my husband? How did it happen that way? She wanted to express this doubt to him. Who and what are the people who could decide whether he is really so much smarter than everyone else? She asked herself, and went over in her imagination the people whom Pierre greatly respected. Judging by his accounts, there was no one he respected so much as Platon Karatev. "You know what I'm thinking about," she said, "about Platon Karatev. How about him? Would he approve of you now?" Pierre was not surprised in the least by this question. He understood his wife's train of thoughts. "Platon Karatev?" he said, and fell to thinking, evidently trying in all sincerity to imagine Karatev's opinion on the subject. "He wouldn't understand, but anyhow, I think yes." "I love you terribly," Natasha said suddenly. "Terribly, terribly." "No, he wouldn't approve of me," said Pierre, having reflected. "What he would approve of is our family life. He wished so much to see seemliness, happiness, peace in everything. I would have shown us to him with pride. Now you say, parting. But you wouldn't believe what special feelings I have for you after we've been parted." "Yes, there's also," Natasha began. "No, it's not that. I never stopped loving you. And it's impossible to love more, and that's especially. Well, yes, he did not finish because their eyes met and said all the rest. What stupidity, Natasha said suddenly, that the honeymoon in the first time is the happiness. On the contrary, now it's best. If only you didn't go away. Remember how we quarreled? And it was always my fault. Always. And what we quarreled about, I don't even remember. Always the same, said Pierre, smiling. Jealous. Don't say it, I can't bear it, Natasha cried, and a cold, angry gleam lit up in her eyes. Did you see her? She added after a pause. No, and if I had, I wouldn't have recognized her. They fell silent. Ah, we were talking, you were talking in the study, I was looking at you, Natasha began, clearly trying to ward off the intruding cloud. You and he are as alike as two drops of water. The boy, I mean, she referred to her son that way. Ah, it's time to go to him. Time. Too bad I have to leave. They fell silent for a few seconds. Then they suddenly turned to each other and started saying something at the same time. Pierre began with self-satisfaction and enthusiasm, Natasha with a quiet, happy smile. Colliding, they both stopped, giving way to each other. No, what were you saying? Speak, speak. No, you tell me. Mine was just something stupid, said Natasha. Pierre said what he had started. It was a continuation of his self-satisfied discourse about his success in Petersburg. It seemed to him at that moment that he was called upon to give a new direction to the whole of Russian society and the whole world. I was going to say only that all the thoughts that have great consequence are always simple. My whole thought is that, since vicious people band together and constitute a force, honest people need only do the same. It's that simple. Yes. And what were you going to say? Just something stupid. No, but still, it's nothing. Trifle, said Natasha, her smile shining still more brightly. I only wanted to tell you about Petya. Today the nanny came to take him from me. He laughed, closed his eyes, and pressed himself to me. He must have thought he was hiding. He's awfully sweet. That's him shouting, well, goodbye, and she left the room. At the same time, downstairs, in Nikolenka Bolkonsky's part of the house, in his bedroom, an icon lamp was burning as always. The boy was afraid of the dark, and they could not get him to drop this bad habit. Desales slept propped up on his 4 pillows, and his Roman nose produced the steady sound of snoring. Nikolenka, having just woken up in a cold sweat, his eyes wide open, sat up in his bed and looked around. A terrible dream had awakened him. In his dream he had seen himself and Pierre wearing helmets, the kind illustrated in his edition of Plutarch. He and Uncle Pierre were marching at the head of a huge army. This army consisted of slanting white lines that filled the air like spiderwebs that hung about in the fall, and that Desales called le fil de la Vierge, the thread of the Virgin. Ahead was glory, just the same as these threads, only slightly denser. He and Pierre were racing lightly and joyfully nearer and nearer their goal. Suddenly the threads that moved them began to weaken, to tangle. The going became heavy, and Uncle Nikolai Ilyich stood before them in a stern and menacing pose. Did you do that? He said, pointing to the broken-up waxen pens. I loved you, but a Reek chief has given me orders, and I'll kill the first one who moves forward. Nikolenka turned to look at Pierre, but there was no longer any Pierre. Pierre was his father, Prince Andrei, and his father had no image or form, but he was there, and seeing him, Nikolenka felt weak from love, but he felt strengthless, boneless, liquid. His father caressed and pitied him, but Uncle Nikolai Ilyich moved closer and closer to them. Nikolenka was overcome by terror and woke up. Father, he thought. Father. Though there were 2 portraits of a good likeness in the house, Nikolenka never pictured Prince Andrei in his human form. Father was with me and caressed me. He approved of me. He approved of Uncle Pierre. Whatever he says, I'll do. Mucius Scavola burned his hand. Why shouldn't it be the same in my life? I know that they want me to study, and I will study, but someday I'll stop, and then I'll do it. I ask God for only one thing, that it's the same with me as with the men in Plutarch. I'll do the same. I'll do better. Everyone will know me, love me, admire me. And Nikolenka suddenly felt sobs seize his breast, and he burst into tears. Êtes-vous indisposé? Are you unwell? Desales' voice was heard. Non, replied Nikolenka, and he lay back on the pillows. He's kind and good. I love him, he thought of Desales. But Uncle Pierre, oh, what a wonderful man. And father, yes, I'll do something that even he would be pleased with. And that is the end of part 1. Interesting. I need to look up when the revolution. I can't think of the word. What's the word? But it starts with a B. But yeah, when the revolution happens in Russia. Because I'm wondering if this is a foreshadowing of the next war in the Russian saga. But very interesting. I love seeing the development of the couple's life. It's kind of really cute to see their sort of development as couples in such a seems like mostly sort of healthy way, how they admire so many things about each other, and that's what kind of brings them closer, and they're weaving together as people. I feel like you don't see that enough in literature. I feel like it's always like men are from Mars and women are from Venus, or what have you. I think it's lovely. Well, anyways, I've kept you guys very long today. Thank you for sticking around, and I will see you tomorrow and to start part 2 and almost finish the book. So thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day. Ciao.